Welcome back, dear viewers. The blue diode on my webcam threw little comets across my mug. 20,000 of you now. Thank you. I smiled, hit end, and watched the tiny red light blink to black. The kitchen went immediately cavern quiet. The hum of the fridge, the sigh of the AC, Shinjuku's insomnia, muffled by double glass. It was 3:04 a.m., the hour when even the trains sounded like they were apologizing for existing. I opened the NHK stream to drown my own thoughts and caught the headline mid-crawl. Imperial Household Agency suspends all subterranean access to Keyhole and Fuji lava systems, indefinite. Under it, the smaller explain-away, seismic safety, unauthorized entries, public protection. My mouth went dry as if I'd bitten an unripe persimmon. 3 weeks ago, I'd asked Nakamura-sensei about our Fuji permits and watched the color slip from his face like tea cooling. "Some wells," he'd said, and fussed with his glasses, "are covered for reasons older than paperwork, Aya." My phone buzzed across the table. Daiichi. "You see the Kofun thing?" Me. "Yeah." "Safety?" "Sure." Daiichi. "And a cabinet office says they found something." "Won't say." She sounded wrong on the phone. Used a phrase, ikiteru kenchiku, living architecture. In Nakamura's most esoteric seminar, he'd meant houses that behaved like companions, timber that moves with the seasons, footing that rides the soil's breath. Metaphor, not an incident report. I set the mug down and opened 3 windows at once. The lab slack, dead quiet. An archaeology Discord I lurked in under a neutral username, and a private forum for karst and lava tube researchers where the default tone ran from gently skeptical to professionally paranoid. Noise everywhere, copy-paste fear, then a pinprick of real. A verified field tech with a Kyoto University address posted 3 words and a coordinate string. East spiral sealed. Within a minute, the account was gone. The post went with it. I searched the coordinate against Showa-era surveys, a rail prospecting map from the 1950s, an old environmental impact PDF I'd had to sweet talk out of a retired civil engineer. The east spiral wasn't on any of them, but on a declassified hydrology scan from 1977, the pixels in that section weren't noise. They were omission, like someone had painted the page with the color called nothing. I worked on through the collapse of night into the part of morning that smells like damp pavers. The more I layered maps, the less they aligned. Tendons of lava tunnels jumped like bad stitches. Acoustic notes, literal musical notation, appeared in margins where they had no business being, flat, natural, and an unfamiliar mark that looked like a keyhole turned sideways. By 6 o'clock, I could feel my pulse in the pads of my fingers. By 7:10, I'd bought a Shinkansen ticket to Nara, told no one, and stuffed a helmet and headlamp into my backpack because rituals make you brave. The news anchors were still smiling politely about safety as the bullet train slid out of the city like a knife leaving a sheath. On the platform at Kyoto, a child hummed a fragment of tune into his fist. His mother shushed him without malice. I recognized 2 of the notes without knowing how. In the seat behind me, a businessman slept with his phone face down on a BBC article full of words that were air around the absence. Precautionary, protection, cooperation with local stakeholders. Every statement sounded like a hallway with the lights off. Heat lay over Nara like a sleeping cat, heavy and absolute. I flagged a taxi for the hotel because I wanted the small talk, the barometer of someone who had no reason to care about my thesis. Hashihaka area? The driver asked after I gave the address. He was mid-40s, hair clipped with barber precision that had learned to work around a widow's peak. His name tag read Sato. Hotel first, I said, then the museum. Then maybe a walk? He nodded, the way drivers do when a passenger's itinerary fits an old groove. His gaze clicked to the coil of rope peeking from my backpack. Mountaineer? Hydrogeology, I smiled. Lava tubes. His hands tightened on the wheel so slightly it could have been the turn. Is something wrong? I asked, too fast, the way you do when you want a stranger to confirm your private dread. He considered, then offered a proverb instead of an answer. Gu ishiha, chanku kang era, he said. Old stones think for a long time. After a beat, don't go alone into old stone these days. What kind of old stone? He chewed the question and swallowed it. Better with a group, he said, and left it there. The hotel lobby smelled like air conditioning and lemon solvent. The clerk smiled the way clerks are trained to smile at women traveling alone with expensive helmets. Her eyes darted once to the screen where NHK looped the suspension notice behind a politician's careful mouth. When I asked about museum hours, she said open, and when I asked about tours near Hashihaka, she said maintenance, and when I asked about who to ask, she said tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived inside the hour. The prefectural museum's front doors were open. The gift shop was doing the brisk trade of people who planned to be interested later, and a laminated sign said, open until 1700 hours. A security guard with a posture like a metronome stopped me at the threshold with a quiet, Shenshi gozaimasen. Emergency maintenance, he said. His tone contained the ghost of an apology. It says, he didn't look at the sign. Emergency, he repeated, and the words slid off the marble like oil off steel. I walked the museum's perimeter, pretending to look for a better angle for a photograph. Through a high window, I saw 3 lab coats, a tripod, and 2 people not in vests doing something to a core sample with a handheld device that looked like the child of a flute and a caliper. Maintenance, I thought, and almost laughed. I let the heat herd me into a tea shop with fans that pushed the air around like an argument going nowhere. The server was my age or a practiced year older. When I asked too quickly about Kofun tours, she looked at my mouth instead of my eyes. It's a very hot day, she said. Sweet things taste better when it's hot. When she set the shaved ice in front of me, she hummed a 3-note pattern under her breath to the rhythm of the ice spoon on the glass. The sound lodged under my ribs like a hiccup. She didn't seem to notice she'd made any sound at all. The afternoon unfolded in little admissions. Shopkeepers, whose sentences took long curves around the words I said. A tour brochure with a hand-corrected map that left an entire district abruptly blank. A flyer on a community board asking for volunteers to help catalog garden artifacts behind a museum annex I'd never seen open. Back at the hotel, the desk clerk had been replaced by a man with anxious hands and a smile that overshot the mark. My room key came with a slip that explained preemptively, apologetically, that housekeeping would be delayed tomorrow due to staffing. We start at 7, he added. I didn't plan to sleep. I planned to read, gather, seed emails back to the lab formatted like questions and encoded like flags. But Nara's heat broke at dusk and left a vacuum. The body rushes to fill vacuums with whatever it can, and mine filled it with exhaustion. By the time I stepped into the Kissiton, the oldest one, the kind that collects afternoons the way trees collect rings, my bones felt hollow enough to light from inside. The room smelled like wood varnish and coffee celebrating itself. 3 men argued gently about baseball at a volume that asserted the conversation did not need to reach the door. He slid into the booth across from me with the uncanny ease of someone who has never bumped a table edge in his life. Linen jacket, the cheap kind that becomes a uniform so sincere the cloth apologizes for itself. His hair was the exact gray of ash after it gives up. "Takahashi Aya," he said softly, like reading a dedication. "Nakamura's student." I sat very still. "I'm sorry, have we—" "You haven't," he said, "but I have. Senda Toru, once of Todai. They keep me retired for everyone's benefit." He took a folder from the inside pocket of the jacket, set it on the table, and pushed it 2 centimeters toward me without making the paper whisper. I opened it because the gesture had too much gravity to refuse. The photographs were bad in the way the best photographs are bad, taken fast in the wrong light, with hands that had something more important to do. They showed curves that shouldn't exist, stone that bent like tendon and held like arch, lattices growing out of wall like frost-discovered architecture. In one frame, a set of long marks on a surface presented as writing, until you looked away and realized your peripheral vision was translating them anyway. "These are not kofun," Senda said, which was obvious and yet still the right sentence. "They are beneath a kofun, older than the mound built above them by conservative estimate, millennia. How? The agency sealed an entrance under Hashihaka. Steel, concrete words. It hasn't held. The song started again 2 days ago. The what? It came out as flat text. He didn't explain. He hummed 3 notes. Hearing is something muscles do as much as eardrums. The sound he made braided itself into the coffee machine's cough, into the faint ferrying of traffic, into my own pulse. I felt it in the hinges of my jaw and the radius of my forearm and the small bones of my left ear, the ones I broke as a kid and forgot about until winter. He watched my face with the quiet triumph of a man who had not wanted to be right. "You hear it." I set my spoon down and missed the saucer on purpose just to make a sound that belonged to me. "What is it?" "A door," he said. "A very polite door. Polite doors announce themselves. Sometimes they knock back." "Go home," he said then, suddenly and so gently it cut. "Close the tabs. Block the words. Your thesis can become about something else. There will be glory there too. Fewer prices. You didn't come to tell me that." He sighed, a sound that could have been any age. "No," he said. "I came because Nakamura called me 3 weeks ago and asked me to keep an ear out for a student who has always loved water that runs where the map insists it cannot. If you insist on curiosity, be precise about it. Tomorrow night, midnight, North Side Service Road, behind the museum storehouse. Turn off your phone 2 blocks away. If you feel watched, and you will, you are. If you hear humming from the ground, do not answer. Yet, his smile was almost kind. Polite doors don't like to be rushed. We parted like a promise we both wanted to break. Outside, the heat had filed its protest and gone home. Cicadas tried their best to soundtrack the night. The hotel looked like a place from a brochure advertising restrained luxury. The elevator said 5 in a voice that wanted to sell me an appliance. In my room, the AC register exhaled, and the headboard hum took up residence at the base of my skull. I opened my laptop to send one message and found myself reading. Instead, Showa-era inspection memos where an engineer had drawn in a margin 3 notes and the word Yamenasai written twice, then erased. A Yamato University thesis on Kofun alignments that never used the word acoustic, but devoted a footnote to a farmer who refused to plow within a certain radius because his cows got lost in their own heads. A scanned page from a Meiji travelogue describing a mound that sings when the clouds are heavy, followed by 3 missing pages. I wrote nothing. Every sentence formed in me already felt untrue by the time it reached my fingers. Sleep came the way a wave comes when you turn your back, sudden, unsurprised by itself. The knock came at 5:47, polite, 2 beats, a breath, 2 beats again. "Housekeeping," a woman's voice said through the door. Soft, not rehearsed. I blinked at the digital clock. The numbers had the wrong authority. I thumbed my phone dark out of habit and peered through the peephole. A uniform, a cart, the correct kind of posture, but her gaze wasn't on the door. It hung 3 centimeters to the left as if someone were standing there whispering instructions. "I don't need anything," I called. My voice sounded like something borrowed. A pause, then, in Japanese so careful it could have been recited from a class, "Special message for Ms. Takahashi." Every hair on my arm stood and listened. I didn't order any. I began and stopped, because right then my brain did the math it should have done in the lobby. The clerk's extemporized staffing speech, the humming server, the guard's metronome, 3 notes in a coffee shop, a folder of photographs of stone that moved as if remembering its shape. I picked up the room phone and called the front desk. It rang twice before the polite voice answered. "I'm on 5, I said. "Do you send housekeeping before 7? A beat. Another. "No, ma'am," the clerk said. "Our housekeeping begins at 7. "Do you have a staff member outside my—" He didn't finish. The line clicked empty. I returned to the peephole fast enough to bruise the socket. The hallway was a rectangle of carpet, 2 doors, a red fire extinguisher behind glass that offered me my own small, distorted face. No cart, no shoes, no woman. Just a faint 3-note hum that might have been the elevator thinking about its job and might have been old stone considering mine. I didn't open the door. I stood with my eye against the peephole until the circle of hallway burned into my vision and followed me when I blinked. The hum in the headboard settled from presence to memory, but even after it softened, I could feel a thread of it through the carpet, as if the building itself were listening for my next move. At 7, the real housekeeping cart rattled down the corridor with the small, officious thunder of plastic wheels. I cracked the door long enough to say, "A toad," and watched the woman's gaze, present, direct, human, meet mine without flinching. It calmed me more than coffee could. I planned to spend the day in motion, not because motion would save me, but because stillness made me into a place someone could knock. I left a note for myself by the kettle, turn off phone 2 blocks early, and forced a morning to happen. Konbini coffee, a paper bought only to be folded and carried, a walk that drew a careful perimeter around the museum and its annexes. Everywhere, signs had multiplied overnight. Guan Si Je Yiwai Liru Jinju. Authorized personnel only. The words were ordinary enough. The density of them on fences felt like someone piling chairs against a door. At the museum, the same metronome straight guard gave me the same apology with less of his face attached to it. On the north side, a service road I had passed before without registering. It was now impossible not to see. 2 rectangular tire marks, fresh enough to smell faintly of rubber, ended at a gate that existed in the geometry of the fence but not in the logic of the visible latch. If I stood at an angle and pretended to watch a bird, I could make out the square where paint had aged differently. I sat in a park where cicadas pushed a field recording through the trees and pretended to write about karst aquifers. A boy on the adjacent bench tapped 3 notes on his phone, on the bench, on the rail, unconsciously seeking surfaces that would give the sound back to him with the right kind of kindness. His grandmother told him to stop, and then, after a few minutes, found herself tapping the same pattern with her cane. By noon, the heat had recast the city in mirage colors. I took refuge in a Kisseton, nowhere near the one from last night. It didn't matter. The coffee tasted the way coffee always tastes when a place has used the same pot for 20 years. A man at the counter read a horse racing paper and hummed, precisely off-key enough to be an accident, unless you could feel the mood of the room tilt toward him whenever he held the last note a fraction too long. I turned over Senda's folder in my mind until the photographs began to feel less like evidence and more like a promise. At 4, the lab Slack finally pinged, 2 innocuous messages about equipment budgets and the proper storage of lithium batteries. I wrote back with emojis and a reassurance that I would deliver my chapter draft soon, a word that wears 1,000 disguises. When I closed the app, the hum rose a little, as if the room approved the decision. I napped because my body demanded tribute before I trespassed. When I woke, it was to a sunset that strutted and then disappeared as if embarrassed by its own display. I ate in the hotel restaurant and couldn't taste anything that wasn't metal. At 10:30, I checked my bag, rope, headlamp, notebook, old university ID that had gotten me into more places than my face ever would, and slid my phone into airplane mode without trusting it to mean what it said. At 11:30, 2 blocks from the museum, I powered the phone completely off. The resulting silence had weight. The city thinned by degrees. Vending machines stood under their own unwitting halos. The North Side Service Road presented itself as an absence among presences. No cars, no delivery carts, no sound but the summer, and faintly, a chord you could pretend was the memory of your own breath. Senda stepped out of the dark, not like a person emerging, but like a figure resolving, as if a lens had decided to stop lying. His linen jacket looked less like affectation and more like uniform under an overshirted night. "You came," he said softly, as if it were a test whose answer he already knew. "I turned off my phone 2 blocks away," I said, and he smiled the barest amount. "Good." Some doors disliked the sound of search signals. 2 men stood at the fence, their uniforms an amalgam of municipal and museum and something that had never existed until this week. They wore the stillness I had learned to distrust, too even, too rehearsed. Looking at them directly made them ordinary. Watching them in the corner of my eye made them wrong. "Guan Si J?" one asked. "Consultant," Senda said, with the bored authority of someone who had once supervised 200 grad students and 3 budgets the size of small moons. Neither man asked for ID. One tapped a code into a keypad disguised as a breaker box. There was no beep, no polite confirmation. The fence decided to stop being fence where a gate had always secretly been. The smell of the earth beyond it was not the smell of dirt. It was a mineral breath. "From here," The nearer guard said, "Alone." Ren," Senda countered, and the guard, so still, too still, tilted his head precisely the degree that meant both acceptance and acknowledgement of a message already received from elsewhere. He stepped aside. The door that wasn't a door slid back a meter. It didn't scrape. Beneath it, a ramp where you expected stairs. Light without bulbs edged the floor in a line as thin as a decision. "Phone's off past this point," the farther guard said, and then, almost under breath, "Not Japanese, and not quite any language I knew." 3 notes that the walls returned with the intimacy of an old friend repeating your secret back to you. I followed Senda down. The first thing to go was distance. The LED strips implied a slope that did not match the way my body remembered walking. The curve of the tunnel held me without ever touching me. In my head, architectural history tapped my shoulder. Edo stonework, Meiji concrete, post-war tunnels, the catalog of human undergrounds. None of them fit the texture under my palm. The wall felt not soft, not yielding, but patient, as if it had guidance to offer if I remembered how to ask. We passed one niche that belonged to the present, a folding table, 2 clipboards, a tablet frozen mid-graph. A plastic water bottle lay on its side with 3 drops in it that refused to gather into one. The hair at the nape of my neck prickled. The hum in the bones of my face shifted from music to weather. "I hate abandoned equipment," I said, because banality kept the fear in a shape I could hold. "They left quickly," Senda agreed, "or they left correctly." "How does one leave correctly?" "By understanding that you are not being kicked out," he said. "You are being shown the edges of a room you didn't know you were in." The tunnel widened in the way nerves branch, inevitability disguised as choice. LED strips gave way by degrees to something else. At first, I mistook it for reflection, a sheen, a brush of sheen on corners where no moisture beaded. Then the light became itself, phosphor without bulb, the faintest blue-white glow threaded through lattices that hooked themselves into the structure like Ivy learned mathematics. The air tasted like wet coins and ceramic, and the moments before thunder, we stepped into a chamber, and the hum resolved into a key. I will be reckless here and admit, we teach ourselves that revelation should be sudden and accompanied by light. This wasn't that. It was recognition. The chamber didn't resemble any diagram in any book I had ever inhaled. It resembled a memory I didn't know I owned. Ribs, stone, crystal, rose and met in arches that could bear weight because they were never carrying it alone. Between them, lattices that pulsed with a rhythm that had nothing to do with my pulse and still taught my pulse to adjust. On a sawhorse, an archaeologist's bag. On the floor, a measuring tape stretched to a span that ended in mid-air because the thing it had meant to measure had refused the premise. A tripod slouched like a man who had waited too long for an answer. Aya. My name came from my left, and from somewhere behind my left, and from the air 3 inches above my left shoulder. I turned and found my professor assembling himself out of the edges of the room. "Nakamura-sensei," I said, and the honorific was a lifeline. He was changed, not in the way movie monsters make men into allegories, in the way a caterpillar makes a case for patience. His skin held light in it the way lacquer holds light. The whites of his eyes were not whiter. They were layered, like someone had added depth to the part of the eye that is supposed to be pure field. When he smiled, there was a harmonic to the gesture, and intention made sound. "Yatsuto," he said, relief under control. "You heard." Senda found me, I said, because cause and effect felt like a talisman. I found you because you were already on your way, Senda said, gently refusing credit. What did they... I began, and stopped because the sentence assumed a they and a you that might no longer be accurate. What happened? What always happens when you step through a polite door and do not immediately run, Nakamura said. You discover how large the room is. He stepped aside, and the chamber decided we had passed its test. The far wall did not open so much as retract its obligation to be a wall. Beyond it, space, plural in a singular body. My breath stalled, recovered, and revised itself. It wasn't a hall. It wasn't a cave. The city presented itself as a hypothesis that was tired of waiting to be tested. Columns grew like coral and also like mathematics. Platforms unfurled from walls like the inside of a shell. What should have been ceiling opened into more city. A slow cascade of terraces and bridges that didn't need to be bridges because the floor felt as continuous as a sentence without period. Light came from the lattices and also from plants that had decided leaves were a good place to keep secrets, and from lines along the edges of stone that were calligraphy first and illumination second. If there were straight lines, they were earned. Figures moved in the space like people who had never learned to walk badly. Some were unmistakably human. Some had made a different set of choices at the fork, where bone decides whether to be hinge or suspension bridge. None reacted to our presence as if we were intruding. "Welcome," said a voice that put a new shape to the word. The being stood as tall as a tall human backlit by a lattice that agreed with its angles. Joints where joints made human sense. The grace of movement that made a different kind of sense entirely. Their eyes were not gemstones. They were depth given an interface. I was certain I could have drowned there and been rebuilt correctly. I am called Chiao Noida, bridge between songs, they said, and their name didn't sit on my ear so much as in the space behind my ear where language practices before it takes the stage. Aya Takahashi, your blood carries old markers. Your mind has not forgotten as thoroughly as it was taught. Every instinct in me reached for the nearest durable myth. Gods, aliens, ancestors, monsters. Every good lesson I'd ever been given about not letting words colonize experience ordered me to stand still and let reality introduce itself. What are you? I heard myself ask, as if questions had owners. What you are, once remembering, becomes easier than forgetting, the bridge said, and the answer, instead of satisfying, made a larger question-shaped space. Senda, who had the good sense to look both frightened and grateful, spoke quietly. We told her the agency sealed Hashihaka. They sealed a seam, the bridge said. Seams do not dislike being sealed. They simply remember other ways to join. Why now? I asked. The mounds have been there longer than our calendars have been honest about. Why open the door? We did not open it, the bridge said, and there was no scold in it. You drilled. You bored. You drove rails that sang in keys we asked you not to play. You tuned cities to hum without asking what in the earth would harmonize. The barriers, treaties written in geometry, hold until they do not. It is easier to speak than to let collapse write the conversation. Nakamura led me along a promenade that hung without hanging from nothing I could name. People passed us with the polite attention humans give each other in cities that have lasted longer than any single generation's memory. The hum braided itself into footfall, into breath, into the feeling of the stone under my palm that never cooled or warmed because it kept the temperature of an idea. The chamber where they took me smelled like rain in a place where rain had never physically occurred. At its center, a structure rose from the floor like a tree that had decided tree was a subset of crystal. Branches, or veins, reached toward the vaulted knot ceiling and disappeared into it. Between them, a platform had the exact shape of a question someone had designed to be answered by a body. I stopped on the threshold because thresholds matter. "This is not abduction," Senda said softly. "This is not capitulation," Nakamura added, with that same steady mischief he used to deploy against departmental politics. "It is continuation." "What happens if I sit?" I asked, letting the smallest of my fears go first, so the larger could follow without thrashing. "You remain yourself," the bridge said. "You add the rest of yourself. You gain a language your bones have been speaking alone. You will be able to step between a street and a seam and not lose your balance." "And if I don't?" "Choice is a technology," they said. "We honor it. The song will not stop. Some who refuse learn to live beside it. Some break themselves trying to prove they cannot hear. We prefer not to watch either. Will it hurt?" The question belonged to a child and to me, which is another way of admitting they are often the same. "It will be uncomfortable," Nakamura said with the scientist's refusal to lie. "Like growing. Like telling the truth to muscles that have been acting." The chair was not a chair. It was an invitation made of substance. When I stepped closer, the hum rose hardly at all and somehow filled the room. Light traced the veins in the crystal and found a path through them it hadn't needed until now. The first touch wasn't touch. It was taste. Copper, but not blood. A coin held on the tongue to confirm value. Then hearing grew a new floor. I could place the sources of 3 different resonances and then, unhelped by any training I had, the places where those sources had been yesterday. My fingers felt longer by a fraction I could have measured if I had trusted myself with a ruler in that moment. "Why do I feel like I've stood here before?" I asked, and my voice split a little at the edges, like a chord testing whether it could still be a single note. "Because you have," the bridge said. "Not as Aya. As someone whose hand is part of yours." I looked at Senda. He nodded once, an old man receiving his own last good advice. "Doors remember the palms that teach them to be doors," he said. "Go on." "Polite, is it?" I asked the chair, the room, the city, the seam, my own blood. "If I sit, will you still be polite?" The hum answered with patience, which is what politeness looks like when it decides to be useful. I sat. The first change was in my mouth, a slip of copper where no coin sat, the taste of a battery touched to the tongue in childhood, proof by sting. Then sound grew rooms inside itself. The hum I had been hearing for days developed a stairwell and a balcony. My name echoed on both as if trying out acoustics. Light followed. Lines on the crystal branches above me were no longer decoration but script. Then not script but grammar. Then not grammar but a tide, meaning moving under a surface I had taken for floor. "Breathe," Nakamura said, and when I obeyed, the breath had weight. I could feel it push against the inside of my ribs and then, stranger, against the inside of the chamber, as if the room had lungs and we were sharing them. "It will stop being odd," Senda promised. "It will stay extraordinary." Bridge between songs, stood where the lattice leaned into the tree and let the harmonics of the room lay across their shoulders like a garment. "You are not being remade," they said. "You are being reintroduced to yourself." The reintroduction was not a montage. It was the patient work of a muscle relearning a forgotten angle. The chair did not pierce me or swallow me. It held, and the lattice sang, and the song found places to vibrate that I had mistaken for empty. I felt, inexplicably, the memory of rain in a place where no rain fell. I knew where the tunnel we had taken bent 2 degrees more than it should, and why the curve felt kind to knees. A story assembled itself cell by cell. The first treaty, carved in geometry and planted under a burial mound like a root. The second treaty hummed into rails over rivers. The third treaty, ours, still unwritten, waiting in the throats of people who could be taught to listen. When they helped me stand, my balance had shifted 1/2 centimeter toward truth. "Walk," Bridge said. "Let your feet make the map." We did. The city opened calmly. Terraces that had nothing to prove, gardens that rustled with leaves teaching themselves new chords. A woman brushed her palm along a low wall and closed her eyes for the length of a heartbeat. A child ran, stopped, giggled, and put both hands flat to the floor as if greeting a giant sleeping dog. Above, the light in the lattice brightened, then softened, in time with the city's pulse. "Why did you build where you did?" I asked, thinking of mounds aligned to stars and rivers bullied into right angles. "We did not build," Bridge said. "We grew. You built above. Occasionally, you asked us where not to place your weight. Often, you did not ask. We learned to sing under you until your pillars stopped breaking us." "And the agency?" Senda asked Rye. "They have turned a seam into a border and called it protection." "Protection is not a lie," Bridge said. "It simply names the youngest part of the story." At a platform that hung over a drop I could not measure because the drop refused to be one direction at a time, we paused. Someone handed me a bowl of water. I sipped, and the water tasted like a stream I had tracked on a map last year that never appeared where it should have in the field. I laughed, and the laugh split into harmonics and came back to me carrying a memory of my grandmother rinsing rice under a tap and humming to the kettle. "How long?" I asked. "Of the change, of the work, of the treaty unwritten?" "As long as the polite door takes to open fully," Bridge said. "Shorter if the ones who hear help the ones who fear." "Then I need to go back up," I said, and my voice wobbled on the last word, not from doubt, but from the recognition that I was naming a direction too simple for what it meant. They led me to a seam that remembered being a maintenance stairwell for a week in 1968 and a route in the 1200s and a handhold at the end of a flood. The floor rose without moving. The air thinned into Tokyo night. Nara lay behind me. Like the end of a prayer, streetlights insisted gently on a grid. The cicadas were newly embarrassing after what I'd heard below. Children in a choir reassuring each other they were singing. My body kept checking the horizon for the curve of a vault. My ears reached for homes I would now always be within and without. The Shinkansen back was a controlled velocity. In the reflection in the window, I looked like myself with a better night's sleep and eyes someone had wiped clean with a soft cloth. A toddler in the facing row hummed 3 notes out of order. His father's hand settled on his head and unconsciously found the correct third. An old woman palmed the rail when the train swayed and smiled, a private joke shared with Steele. At Shinagawa, The air was hot in the manner of a city telling you it doesn't have to impress you because you will stay regardless. I went home first because the small rituals mattered. Shoes aligned straight in the Genkan, a glass rinsed twice, a plant watered with respect instead of habit. Then I texted Daiichi. Awake? LOL, define. When he opened his door, the habit of humor sagged and the truth stood without it. A glow had found him, the kind that cosmetics pretend to sell. He held his head differently, as if some inner weight had shifted from his shoulders to his spine. I thought I was losing my mind, he said without greeting. Then I thought maybe the building was singing to punish me for late rent. Then my aunt called and asked me what I heard when I touched the wall by the sink, and I hung up on her, and then I apologized, and then I touched the wall, and Aya, what is happening to me? Not punishment, I said, invitation. He laughed once hard. Is this a cult? Blink twice if it's a cult. It's a family argument finally ending, I said. You can blink if you want. It won't change the song I taught him, small things first, the way the bridge had promised we must. Breathe with the hum like it's a metronome, not a metronome like it's a law. Press your palm flat to the floor and don't push. Just wait until the floor decides to greet you. When the kettle harmonizes with the elevator cables, hum back one note lower and feel the cables relax. He obeyed, reluctantly at first, then as a man discovering that obedience and curiosity were not enemies. The news tried on various tones: assurance, alarm, the hard-edged comfort of numbers. The Imperial Household Agency tripled its soft language around safety. Subways paused and resumed in alternating districts with explanations that satisfied no one and inspired no one to panic either. On a talk show, a pale man with excellent hair called for containment. 2 days later, he returned with sand under his nails and proposed a bill funding listening rooms, quiet spaces staffed by doctors and architects who could teach people how not to be frightened by the floor. That week, I went live for the first time since the night of the notice. The red light painted my knuckles. Comments arrived in a stutter that looked like weather. I watched the counter climb past 20,000. I could have opened with science, acoustic diagrams, water table overlays, photographs that would not show what they were. But I remembered what Nakamura had said in a lab at midnight once: start where the body says yes. Welcome back, I said. Thank you for being here. I used to make videos about water finding ways our maps did not predict. I'm still doing that. The maps got larger. If you've been hearing something at night, or if train stations feel louder in your chest, you're not sick. If you can't sleep because your building hums when the rain stalls, you're not cursed. Put your palm on the floor, breathe in, wait. The earth will answer. It has been trying for a long time. The chat divided itself into camps: scorn in capital letters, gratitude that stuttered, questions practical and impossible. I tried to be a person, not an evangelist. I recommended water, salt, quiet, neighbors. I said tomorrow less and now more. On a Saturday that arrived already tired, the sky over Tokyo changed its mind. Clouds thickened, not like threat, but like rehearsal. Air gathered itself on balconies. Pigeons tipped their heads and adjusted nothing. Somewhere, a child timed a jump rope to a 3-note pattern. The first drop hit my window like a fingertip. The city inhaled. Rain began, and it did what rain always does. It touched everything it could and called it by name. Only this time, it called in chords. Gutters took a low line, Leaves answered in a thin, bright ribbon. Rails, oh the rails, thundered their old labor into a harmony that made my knees want to soften in thanks. People on a crosswalk under transparent umbrellas stopped mid-stride without meaning to. A cyclist put a foot down and bowed his head, not to pray, just to hear better. I texted Daichi, "River? Now." We ran because running, too, is a ritual. The conda snarled under its concrete and then smoothed, the surface writing cursive in a hand older than the channel. On the far bank, where ivy had been pretending not to climb for years, a seam announced itself by refusing to be an edge. Water slid toward it without haste, and the line between above and below undid a knot it had been holding with its teeth. "Do you see it?" I asked. Daichi nodded, eyes bright with an emotion that needed a new word. "It feels like when a song finally lands on the note it was always going to." Around us, the ordinary performed its small miracles. An office worker tilted his umbrella and discovered that his shoes were humming with the bridge. Two schoolgirls in uniforms synchronized their steps unconsciously and then giggled because it felt like flying. A grandmother at the railing, hair like clouds that had learned patience, tapped 3 notes with her cane and then rested both palms on the rail as if greeting a cat. The metal answered. She closed her eyes for the length of a memory. The rain kept at its lesson. On screens in electronics shops, anchors lowered their voices to match the rooms. A crawl at the bottom of a broadcast used a new phrase, Gong Ming Zhu Yuan Center, resonant support centers, without blinking as if it had always been policy. Somewhere under us, a door decided it could call itself a bridge in public now. Senda texted a photograph of Hashihaka at dusk, not opened, not violated, but listening. In the corner of the frame, a young guard, uniform too large, posture too straight, had one hand against the earth and one on his radio, and a look on his face like a man discovering he spoke 2 languages as a child and had been using the wrong one to say his own name for years. Nakamura sent a voice memo, 3 seconds long. A kettle, a cord, a laugh that broke and caught. "Is this the end?" Daichi asked, the rain flattening his hair against his forehead, his mouth unsure how to shape such a large question. "This is the end of pretending we don't share walls," I said. "It's the beginning of learning how to knock without breaking our hands." We stood until the skin on our fingers wrinkled and the river rode us into its long sentence. I felt the crystal at my throat warm as the network's attention grazed me. No command, only company. I turned home only when my bones told me the floor would not be offended by absence. That night, I streamed again, soaking hair tamed into a braid that darkened my shirt. I didn't demonstrate. I didn't persuade. I told a story in which a girl grew up loving maps that lied to her and learned to forgive them, because maps are invitations and invitations sometimes arrive late. I asked people to be kind to themselves when their mouths tasted metal, to be patient with relatives who heard nothing yet and with those who heard too much. I said, this will be uncomfortable, and you are not alone in the same breath, because both were true. When the red light clicked off, the room did not empty. The hum sat with me like a friend who knows to let silence do its work. I went to the window and put my palm against the glass. The pane trembled delicately and then steadied, matching my breath. Below, the street carried its new old music. Above, the clouds diluted into a softer gray. Between us, I walked to the river one last time because endings deserve witnesses. The seam on the far bank shone not with light, but with permission. A stray cat shook water from its paws and regarded me with the tolerant scorn cats reserve for people who think anything belongs to them. Somewhere, a train negotiated a curve with gratitude. "Okay," I said to the polite door, to the treaty unwritten, to the child I had been placing paper over drains to hear what the city said back. "We're here." My name answered me from the rail, from the concrete, from somewhere under the concrete where a living architecture exhaled in long time. Not Aya as 3 letters, but as the kanji my grandmother loved, Ling, pattern. The sound braided through bone and rain until it felt less like being called and more like remembering how to sign. The sky cleared in patches, the way a face relaxes in stages. People resumed, but not as before. Steps half a beat slower, heads tilted, umbrellas carried like instruments. The city did not transform. It revealed a layer the way lacquer reveals depth when polished. Under the Keyhole mounds, under the Fuji tubes, under us, rooms waited and would go on waiting long after our particular story made room for other tellings. Behind me, in my apartment, the stream's chat continued to scroll, whole paragraphs of fear, delight, anger, relief. Ahead of me, underfoot, a treaty took its first breaths. In the narrow country between, I stood and listened. "Welcome home," the river said in rain language, which is touching, and the stones answered in stone language, which is staying. I stayed until the last drops lost their melody and became merely water again. And even then, even in the ordinary, the song remained quieter, woven into the grout between tiles, the seam in the road, the small bones of my ear, patient as a door, certain as a hand on a wall, waiting for the next person to knock without fear.